10 days before my wedding, Graham sat across from me at our kitchen table, folded his hands like a man about to say grace, and asked if he could have 30 days with his first love before he married me. Not an affair, he said. Not a betrayal. Just closure. Just 30 days to say goodbye to a woman named Vivian so he could walk down the aisle without a ghost standing beside him. I remember the sound the coffee cup made when it slipped from my hand and shattered against the tile, because that was the exact sound my heart made too. If you believe in kindness even when it's hard to find, if you believe people can surprise you, for better or worse, and if you believe in second chances and the strange, redemptive shape forgiveness sometimes takes, I'd love for you to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community has become a place where stories like mine find a home, and I'm grateful every single day that you're here with us. My name is Marianne Cole, and until that Tuesday afternoon in early September, I believed I understood the man I was going to marry. Graham Whitfield and I had been together for 4 years. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue in Portland, both of us hovering awkwardly near the drink cooler because neither of us knew how to work a room, and by the end of that afternoon we'd talked for 3 hours about nothing and everything. He was an architect, methodical and quiet in the way that some people mistake for coldness but which I'd learned was actually a kind of deep, careful attention. He noticed things. He noticed when I was tired before I said so, noticed when my mother's phone calls left me rattled, noticed the specific way I liked my eggs even though I'd only mentioned it once, a year earlier. I had built my entire understanding of love around the idea that noticing was the same as loving, and for 4 years, that had felt like enough. We were supposed to get married in a restored barn outside of Hood River, the kind of venue with string lights and reclaimed wood tables that photographs beautifully and costs more than a used car. My mother had already ordered the flowers. My sister Odette had already had 3 fittings for her bridesmaid dress. The invitations were long since mailed, 78 of them, each one addressed in careful calligraphy by a woman named Petra who ran a little shop downtown and who had cried a little when she finished the last envelope because, she said, she could tell from the guest list how loved we were. And there I was, 10 days before all of that, staring at a man who was asking me to hand him a permission slip to go spend a month with someone else. He explained it in the calm, reasonable voice he used for everything, the voice that had once made me feel safe and now made me feel like I was being handled. Vivian Marsh, he said, had been his first real love, back in his early 20s, before architecture school, before Portland, before me. They had been together 3 years and it had ended badly, abruptly, the way young love often does, a misunderstanding that spiraled, words said in anger, a slammed door that neither of them ever got to walk back through. He told me he'd run into her 2 months earlier at a conference in Seattle. He told me they'd had coffee. He told me that ever since, he'd been unable to sleep properly, unable to focus on our wedding planning, unable to picture himself standing at the altar without some unfinished business clawing at the inside of his chest. He wanted 30 days. Not to decide between us, he insisted, he loved me, he was certain of that, but to close a door that had been left open for over a decade, so that when he said his vows to me, he could mean them completely. I want to tell you that I screamed. I want to tell you I threw something heavier than a coffee cup. But grief like that doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like sitting very still while your whole future rearranges itself in front of you, silent as falling snow. I asked him if he understood what he was asking. He said he did. I asked him if he understood that no reasonable woman would say yes to this. He said he understood that too, and that he wasn't asking as a reasonable request, he was asking because he trusted me enough to be honest instead of doing something worse in secret, and because he genuinely believed that if I said no, he'd spend our whole marriage wondering, and that wondering would poison us slowly, the way a hairline crack in a foundation eventually brings down a house. There's a version of this story where I begged him to stay. There's a version where I gave him the 30 days, sat by the phone, and waited to see if I'd been chosen. I've read enough of these stories to know how that one usually ends, badly, or with a reconciliation so fragile it barely counts as a happy ending. But something in me, something that had perhaps been waiting years for a reason to stand up straight, refused to play that role. I looked at Graham Whitfield, this man I had loved with the kind of loyalty that asks for nothing back, and I told him that he could have his 30 days. He could have as many days as he needed. But the wedding was going forward exactly as planned, on exactly the date we'd chosen, at exactly the barn we'd booked, in front of exactly the 78 people who'd already promised to be there. The only thing that would change, I told him, was the groom. He laughed at first, the short disbelieving laugh of a man who thinks he's misheard something. Then he saw my face and stopped laughing. I told him I wasn't speaking in metaphors. I meant it literally. If he needed 30 days to go find himself in the arms of a woman from a decade ago, then he had made his choice already, whether he wanted to admit it or not, and I would not be standing at an altar on faith alone, waiting to see if he came back in time. I would not spend the next 3 weeks as a woman on hold. So I told him I was keeping the date. I was keeping the barn, the flowers, the 78 guests, my mother's tears of joy that had already been promised, my sister's dress that had already been altered. I simply wasn't going to marry him. I was going to marry someone else, or perhaps no one, or perhaps I was going to stand up at that barn and marry my own life back to myself, in front of everyone who loved me, and call that a wedding worth having. I didn't know yet what I meant. I only knew that I would not let his 30 days become my 100 hours of quiet humiliation. He didn't take me seriously. That was the first mistake he made, though far from the last. Graham packed a bag 2 days later. I watched him do it from the doorway of our bedroom, watched him fold his shirts with the same careful precision he brought to everything, as if precision could sanitize what he was doing, and he told me he'd call. He told me this wasn't the end of us, just a pause, a comma and not a period. He kissed my forehead on his way out, the way you'd kiss a child you were leaving with a babysitter, and I stood in the doorway of the apartment we'd shared for 2 years and watched him drive away toward a woman named Vivian Marsh, toward a version of his life that apparently still had a hold on him strong enough to threaten the one he'd built with me. My sister Odette showed up within the hour. I hadn't called her, I think some instinct in her, some sisterly radar tuned to my particular frequency of disaster, simply knew. She found me sitting on the kitchen floor amid the shards of the coffee cup I still hadn't cleaned up, and she didn't say anything at first. She just sat down next to me on the cold tile in her work clothes and put her arm around my shoulders and let me shake for a while without asking me to explain. When I finally told her everything, Vivian, the 30 days, the calm reasonable voice, her arm around me tightened until it almost hurt, and I felt her breathing change, felt the particular fury of a sister who loves you build like a held breath. But it was what I told her next that made her go still. I told her about the barn, the flowers, the 78 guests, and how I intended to keep every bit of it. Odette pulled back and looked at me like she was trying to determine whether grief had cracked something loose in my mind. Marianne, she said carefully, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Nobody would blame you for canceling. And I told her the truth, which was that this wasn't about proving anything to the 78 people on that guest list. It was about not letting one man's crisis of nerve dictate the entire shape of my future. I had spent months planning a day meant to celebrate love and commitment and the beginning of something. I refused to let that day become instead a monument to his cowardice, cancelled and mourned and whispered about at every future family gathering. If the day existed, it would exist on my terms. What form that would take, I genuinely did not know yet. I only knew I wasn't ready to let it disappear. Word travels fast in families, and by that evening my mother had called 4 times and my father, a quiet man who rarely inserted himself into what he called the emotional business, had sent a single text that read simply, whatever you decide, we're behind you completely. Always, it was, from him, practically a sonnet. The next several days passed in a strange, suspended fog. I went to work. I managed the events calendar for a regional nonprofit, ironic given what my personal life had become, and I answered emails and I organized a fundraising gala with the same competence I always brought to my job, because work, I discovered, was the only place where the ground still felt solid under my feet. My coworker Delphine, a woman in her 50s with a laugh like a trumpet and absolutely no patience for foolishness, cornered me in the break room on day 3 and made me tell her everything, and when I finished, she set down her coffee with a decisive click and said, "Well, sounds like you need a wedding planner who isn't planning a wedding for him anymore. Sounds like you need a party." I laughed for the first time in days, a real laugh, surprised out of me, and something about her bluntness cracked open a door in my mind that I hadn't known was closed. Because that was it, wasn't it? I didn't need to cancel a wedding. I needed to reclaim a day. The barn was booked. The caterer was paid. The florist, a soft-spoken woman named Ines who'd been arranging peonies and eucalyptus for me for months, had already ordered flowers that would be blooming and beautiful whether or not there was a groom to stand beneath them. 78 people who loved me were going to show up on that date whether there was a wedding or not, because that's what love does, it shows up. And so I decided, sitting at my kitchen table with Delphine's words rattling around in my skull, that I was not going to cancel anything. I was going to hold the celebration exactly as scheduled. I simply hadn't yet decided what, precisely, we would be celebrating. Graham called on day 5. I almost didn't answer, but some old habit of politeness, or perhaps some lingering need to hear his voice and confirm that he was real and this was really happening, made me pick up. He sounded strange, not guilty, not exactly, but unsettled, like a man standing on ground that had shifted slightly beneath him without his permission. He told me things with Vivian were complicated. He told me she had changed in ways he hadn't expected, that the version of her he'd been carrying in his memory for 11 years didn't entirely match the woman sitting across from him now, and that some of what he'd thought was unfinished business turned out to be, in his words, more finished than I realized. I asked him, very calmly, whether he was calling to tell me he was coming home. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear a television playing faintly in the background, some hotel room hum. He said he needed to see the 30 days through. He'd made a commitment, he said, and he didn't want to look back later and wonder. I told him that was fine. I told him I hoped he found whatever he was looking for. And then I told him, because I thought he deserved to know exactly what he was walking away from, that the wedding was still happening on the original date, with or without him, and that I would very much appreciate it if he did not show up uninvited to interrupt it. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked, in a voice that had lost some of its careful calm, what exactly that meant. I told him he'd find out, along with everyone else, and I hung up before he could ask again. My hands were shaking, but for the first time since that Tuesday in September, they were shaking with something other than grief. There was a thread of fury in it now, and underneath the fury, something that felt almost like clarity. The days that followed became a strange, quietly thrilling project. My mother, once she understood I wasn't unraveling but rather reorganizing, threw herself into helping with a fierce energy that reminded me she had once, decades ago, been the kind of woman who organized union strikes at the textile mill where she'd worked before I was born. My father, who rarely spoke more than he needed to, took over the task of quietly informing the 78 guests that the day was still happening, though its nature had shifted, without offering details that would embarrass me, simply saying that Marianne wanted everyone there, and that they should come prepared for something meaningful, if not precisely what they'd expected. Not one person declined. Not one. Odette, meanwhile, appointed herself General of Operations, a role she took to with the intensity of a woman finally given a battlefield worthy of her talents. She sat with me one evening, legal pad in hand, and asked the question that would end up shaping everything that followed: if it's not a wedding, what is it? I didn't have an answer right away. I thought about all the things I'd lost in the last year that had nothing to do with Graham, my grandmother, who'd passed in the spring, a job I'd loved before the nonprofit and left under difficult circumstances, a friendship with a woman named Rosalind that had quietly died the way some friendships do, through neglect rather than betrayal. I thought about how much of adulthood is composed of these small griefs we're never given a formal occasion to mourn, and how much of it is also composed of small victories no one throws a party for: the promotion, the year of sobriety, the decision, finally, after years of putting yourself last, to put yourself first. And I thought about the 78 people who loved me enough to show up for a wedding that had suddenly, spectacularly, come apart, and how rare and precious that kind of love actually is, and how it deserved to be honored regardless of whether there was a ring involved. So I told Odette what it would be. It would be a celebration of Marianne. Not a wedding, not a divorce party, not a bitter ceremony of spite dressed up in white, but a genuine, joyful gathering to mark the beginning of a new chapter, whatever that chapter turned out to be. We would keep the flowers because flowers don't care who they bloom for. We would keep the barn because the barn was beautiful and paid for and full of light. We would keep the 78 guests because every single one of them had shown up in some form during the hardest year of my life, and I wanted, for once, to gather them all in one place and simply say thank you. We would keep the date because that date was mine now, reclaimed, and I refused to let it belong to Graham's cowardice for one moment longer. Odette's eyes filled with tears, and she wrote at the top of her legal pad, in large looping letters, Marianne's Day, and underlined it twice. There is a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't come with fanfare or dramatic music, and I discovered it in myself during those 2 weeks in ways I never expected. I discovered it when I called Ines, the florist, to explain what had happened, bracing myself for complications, and instead heard her go quiet on the phone and then say, softly, "I've made bouquets for a lot of brides, Marianne, but I don't think I've ever made one for a woman marrying her own courage. I'm going to make you the best arrangement of my career." I discovered it when I called the caterer, a gruff man named Boone who ran a barbecue business out of a converted school bus, and he told me, without a hint of judgment, that he'd feed 100 heartbroken women a hot meal any day of the week and consider it an honor. I discovered it in the DJ, a young man named Percival who agreed, without hesitation, to swap out the traditional first dance playlist for something Odette and I curated together, songs about survival and joy and the specific fierce tenderness of women who've been underestimated. And I discovered it, most surprisingly, in a man named Julian Ashworth. I should explain that Julian was not a love interest waiting in the wings, not some convenient romantic solution to soften the story's edges, though I understand why, hearing this, you might expect that turn. Julian was my downstairs neighbor, a soft-spoken widower in his early 40s who taught high school woodworking and had, over the 2 years I'd lived in that building, become something like a friend through the accumulated small kindnesses of shared laundry rooms and borrowed sugar. His wife, Celeste, had died 3 years earlier of an illness that had taken 18 brutal months to run its course, and in that time, I'd watched him become a man who understood grief not as a single wound but as a long, complicated companion you learn to live alongside. When he heard, through the thin walls of our building or through Odette, who had apparently taken to updating half the neighborhood on my situation, what had happened with Graham, he knocked on my door one evening with a bottle of wine and no expectations beyond sitting with me for an hour. He didn't try to fix anything. He didn't offer platitudes about how everything happens for a reason, a phrase I'd come to loathe in the preceding weeks for its casual cruelty toward people in genuine pain. Instead, he told me about the year after Celeste died, when he'd had to relearn how to exist in a life that no longer matched the shape he'd built it to hold. He told me that grief, whether from death or from a different kind of ending, required you to grieve not just the person but the entire imagined future you'd been building with them, the vacations you'd never take, the arguments you'd never have, the small ordinary Tuesdays you'd never share. I cried harder that evening than I had at any point since Graham left, not because Julian said anything particularly extraordinary, but because he was the first person who let me grieve the future rather than rushing me toward being fine. Julian became, over those 2 weeks, a quiet fixture in the strange, improvised effort to build Marianne's Day. He didn't do it because he was courting me, I want to be clear about that, because so many of these stories twist themselves into romance before the heroine has even finished healing, and I refuse to let mine do the same. He helped because he was a man who understood that community is built in exactly these moments, in the unglamorous work of driving to the hardware store for extra string lights or helping Odette build a makeshift arch out of reclaimed barn wood because I mentioned, offhand, that I wanted something to stand beneath even if I wasn't standing beneath it with a groom. He asked for nothing in return. He simply showed up, the way Delphine showed up with her bluntness, the way my father showed up with his quiet texts, the way Ines showed up with flowers that didn't care whose love they celebrated. Graham called twice more in those 2 weeks. The first time, he sounded defensive, almost accusatory, as though my refusal to sit at home pining for his return was itself a kind of betrayal. He'd heard from a mutual friend that I was still having some kind of event on the wedding date, and he wanted to know what exactly I thought I was doing. I told him, with a calm that surprised even me, that I was doing precisely what I'd told him I would do from the beginning, and that his surprise at my follow-through said more about how little he'd believed me than about anything I'd actually done. The second call came 4 days before the date, and this time his voice had lost its edge entirely. He sounded, for the first time in this whole ordeal, genuinely lost. He told me that things with Vivian had ended, not badly, he said, just quietly, both of them recognizing over the course of those weeks that the people they'd been at 22 no longer existed, and that the love they'd shared belonged to those younger selves and couldn't simply be transplanted into the people they'd become. He told me he wanted to come home. He told me, and this was the part that nearly broke something in me all over again, that he still wanted to marry me, that he hoped it wasn't too late. I sat with that for a long moment before I answered. Some part of me, the part that had loved him for 4 years, wanted desperately to say yes, to let him come home, to salvage the wedding and pretend the last 3 weeks had simply been a strange, unfortunate detour on the way to happily ever after. But a stronger part of me, the part that had spent those weeks discovering what it felt like to be held up by an entire community rather than by one uncertain man, understood something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. It was never really about whether Vivian won. It was about what Graham's request had revealed, that when faced with uncertainty, his instinct had been to seek permission to explore an old love rather than to lean into the frightening, necessary work of committing fully to a new one. That kind of hesitation doesn't heal in 30 days just because the other woman turns out to be a disappointment. It reveals a pattern, a way of holding love at arm's length so that no single choice ever fully closes a door. I told him, gently because I did still love him and didn't want to be cruel, that I was glad he'd found his closure, but that I couldn't build a marriage on the version of him that needed a month away from me to be sure I was what he wanted. I told him that whatever I was building now, it deserved a foundation more solid than relief that his other option hadn't worked out. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said he understood, though I don't think, in that moment, he really did. Understanding, I've learned, often arrives late, walking in long after the decision that required it. The morning of what was once meant to be my wedding day arrived with the kind of golden, generous light that Oregon reserves for the days you most need it. I woke early, before my alarm, and lay in bed for a while simply breathing, feeling the strange lightness that comes after you've made peace, even partial peace, with a loss. Odette arrived at 8 with coffee and a garment bag containing not a wedding dress. I'd decided against that. It felt like the wrong kind of costume for the day I was building, but a deep emerald green dress I'd bought on impulse the week before, the color of new growth, the color, Delphine had told me approvingly, of a woman who plants her own garden. The barn, when we arrived, was already transformed. Inessa's flowers spilled from mason jars and hung in soft garlands along the wooden beams, peonies and ranunculus in shades of blush and cream that had nothing to do with bridal tradition and everything to do with simple, unapologetic beauty. Boone's crew was setting up long tables heavy with barbecue and cornbread and the kind of food that makes people linger rather than rush toward a dance floor. Percival was testing his speakers, and somewhere in the rafters, my father and Julian were hanging the last of the string lights, laughing about something I couldn't hear, 2 men from very different corners of my life finding common ground in the simple work of making a space beautiful for someone they cared about. The guests began arriving at 2, dressed in the clothes they'd have worn to a wedding, because I'd asked them to, because I wanted the day to hold its original beauty even as its meaning transformed. I watched from the doorway as 78 people I loved filed into that barn, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as a kind of humbled wonder. There was my Aunt Rosalind, not the friend but my father's sister, who had flown in from Chicago. There was my old college roommate, Thea, who I hadn't seen in 3 years but who'd driven 6 hours the moment she heard what happened. There was Delphine, resplendent in a purple dress that could be seen from space, already crying before the ceremony had even begun. There was Julian, standing quietly near the back, dressed simply, watching the room with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly how much this day cost me to build and wanted to witness every bit of it landing right. At 4 o'clock, instead of walking down an aisle toward a groom, I walked to the center of that transformed barn and stood beneath the arch Julian and Odette had built from reclaimed wood, and I spoke to the people who had shown up for me. I won't pretend I remember every word I said. The speech had been half planned and half improvised, written in fragments over the preceding 2 weeks and rewritten again that very morning, but I remember telling them that this day had been meant to celebrate a marriage, and that in a way, it still was, though not the one any of us had expected. I told them I was marrying myself back to my own life. I was vowing, in front of all of them, to stop mistaking careful attention for love, to stop accepting hesitation dressed up as honesty, to build a future not around someone else's uncertainty but around my own clear-eyed hope. I told them that Graham's request had, in its strange and painful way, given me a gift I hadn't asked for and wouldn't have chosen but couldn't now regret. It had shown me, with brutal clarity, the difference between being loved carefully and being loved completely, and it had shown me that I would rather stand alone in the fullness of my own conviction than stand beside someone who needed a month to be sure of me. I told them, too, that I understood forgiveness not as a single grand gesture but as a practice, something you choose again and again, and that I had chosen, in the 2 weeks since that Tuesday afternoon, to forgive Graham, not to excuse what he'd done, but to release myself from the weight of carrying anger toward a decision that, in the end, had freed me. I told them that hope, real hope, wasn't the belief that nothing bad would ever happen to you, but the stubborn, cultivated belief that even after something breaks, you can build something worth having from the pieces. And I told them that I hoped every single person in that barn, whatever heartbreak they were carrying, whatever door had been closed on them without their permission, would remember this day and remember that a broken plan is not the same as a broken life. There wasn't a dry eye in that barn by the time I finished, and my mother, who had spent weeks holding herself together with the particular ferocity of a woman determined not to fall apart before her daughter did, finally let herself cry openly, her hand pressed to her mouth, my father's arm around her shoulders. Odette read a piece she'd written, something about sisters and armor and the specific fury of loving someone enough to build them an arch out of scrap wood in 11 days. Delphine gave an impromptu toast that involved more cursing than is traditional at weddings but somehow felt exactly right. And then Percival started the music, not a first dance but a song Odette and I had chosen together, something with a driving beat and lyrics about rising, and the whole barn erupted into dancing, 78 people who'd come dressed for a wedding throwing themselves instead into something that felt, if anything, more genuinely joyful for having no script to follow. I danced with my father first, who held my hand with the same careful formality he'd used since I was 6 years old learning to waltz on his shoes, and who told me, quietly, near the end of the song, that he'd never been prouder of me than he was watching me stand up in that barn and tell the truth. I danced with Odette, both of us laughing and crying simultaneously in the way that only sisters can manage. I danced with Delphine, who tried to teach me some move from her youth that neither of us executed correctly and both of us found hilarious. And near the end of the evening, as the light through the barn's high windows turned gold and then amber, sliding toward the one brief stretch of dusk I'll admit into this otherwise sunlit story, Julian approached and asked, with the particular gentleness he brought to everything, whether I'd like to dance, making it clear with his tone that a no would be received exactly as easily as a yes. I said yes, not because the story needed a romantic conclusion, but because in that moment, surrounded by everyone who loved me, having just spent an afternoon declaring my commitment to my own clear-eyed hope, it felt right to dance with a man who had shown up, day after day, asking for nothing, offering steadiness instead of grand gestures. We didn't talk about the future. We didn't make promises. We simply moved together for the length of one song, two people who had both learned, through very different griefs, that healing doesn't happen on anyone else's timeline, and that sometimes the most honest thing two wounded people can offer each other is patience. Before I close this story, I want to ask you something, because I think the people watching this have their own version of a barn full of flowers meant for someone else's promise. If you've ever had to reclaim a day, a plan, a piece of your own life that someone else's hesitation threatened to take from you, I'd love for you to leave a comment and tell me about it. Tell me what you kept. Tell me what you rebuilt. I read every single one, and I think there's something powerful in knowing how many of us have stood in the wreckage of a broken plan and chosen, deliberately, to build something honest from the pieces instead. Graham did not come to the barn that day, though I later learned he'd driven past it once, slowly, unable to bring himself to stop. We spoke a handful of times in the months that followed, brief conversations that gradually softened from raw hurt into something more like distant kindness. He eventually moved to Denver for a job, and the last I heard, through the thinning threads of mutual friends, he was seeing someone new, someone he'd apparently known for years before ever meeting me, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was able to hope genuinely for his happiness, the way you can hope for the happiness of someone whose story simply diverged from yours at a fork neither of you chose but both of you, in the end, needed. As for me, the months after that day were not a fairy tale of instant transformation, because real healing rarely moves that cleanly. There were nights I cried over wedding photos I'd never taken, moments in grocery stores when I saw a couple registering for towels and felt the old grief rise sharp and sudden in my throat. But there were also mornings I woke up and felt, for the first time in years, entirely accountable only to myself, free to shape my days around my own convictions rather than around the careful, conditional attention of a man who needed permission to be sure of me. I threw myself into my work and discovered I was better at it than I'd realized, promoted within the year to Director of Development at the nonprofit, a title that would have felt impossible to imagine during those first raw weeks. I grew close with Julian slowly, over many months, in a friendship that eventually and unhurriedly became something more, though I want to be honest that this story was never really about him, or about finding a replacement groom to complete some tidy romantic arc. It was about learning that I could be my own foundation, that a life built on my own clear-eyed hope was sturdier than any life built on someone else's hesitation, however carefully disguised as honesty. My mother still has the emerald green dress hanging in a garment bag in her closet, and every so often, when I visit, she'll open the door just to look at it, the way you might visit a photograph of a moment you're proud of. Odette's legal pad, with Marianne's Day written across the top in looping letters, sits framed on my bookshelf now, a strange and precious artifact of the 2 weeks when my sister and my mother and my father and a florist and a barbecue cook and a DJ and a quiet widower with sawdust permanently embedded in the creases of his hands all showed up, together, to help me build something joyful out of what could so easily have become only wreckage. I think often about the moment Graham sat across from me at that kitchen table and asked for 30 days, and I no longer feel the hot, immediate fury I felt in that instant, though I remember it clearly. What I feel instead, most days, is a strange and complicated gratitude, because his request, cruel as it felt in the moment, forced a question I might otherwise have spent years avoiding. What do I do when someone I love reveals, plainly, that I am not quite enough on my own to secure their certainty? The old answer, the answer I might have given at 25, would have been to shrink myself further, to try harder, to become more careful and more accommodating in hopes of finally being enough. The answer I found instead, standing in that barn full of flowers that didn't care whose love they celebrated, was to expand instead of shrinking, to gather instead of grasping, to keep the date and change the meaning and let the people who loved me unconditionally fill the space where one uncertain man's love had been. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. There are so many of us, I think, quietly rebuilding our own barns after someone else's hesitation nearly tore them down, and I believe there is real power in telling each other these stories, in bearing witness to one another's second chances. Kindness, I've learned, isn't only what we offer the people who hurt us, though I did eventually offer Graham that too. It's also what we owe ourselves in the aftermath, the kindness of refusing to let someone else's uncertainty write the final chapter of our story, the kindness of gathering the people who love us and saying, simply and honestly, thank you for showing up, and the kindness of believing, even in the wreckage of a broken plan, that something worth having can still be built from the pieces, in the full and generous light of an ordinary, golden afternoon.